The fire did not just take Elias Whitmore's ranch. It took the last prayer he ever planned to say. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if you still believe kindness can survive in a hard world, stay with me for this story. The wind across northern Wyoming smelled like smoke long before the flames reached the barn. Elias noticed it while carrying feed across the muddy yard just after sundown. At first, he thought lightning must have struck somewhere out near the hills. Summer storms had rolled through all week, dry storms with thunder, but almost no rain. But then the horses began screaming inside their stalls. Not loud, not wild, just frightened enough to make a man's stomach turn cold. Elias dropped the grain sack and looked toward the west pasture. Orange light flickered against the clouds. Wrong kind of orange. Too low. Too alive. By the time he reached the barn doors, heat was already pushing through the cracks in the wood. Smoke curled into the dark sky like black ribbons twisting toward heaven. No, Elias whispered under his breath, already running. The old ranch had stood there nearly 30 years. His father built the place with rough pine and stubborn hands. Every fence post, every stable beam, every inch earned beneath the Wyoming sun. Elias shoved open the barn doors, coughing as thick smoke rolled over him. The horses panicked against their ropes, eyes white with terror. He worked fast, cutting restraints, slapping flanks, forcing the animals toward the open field while sparks drifted through the air like burning snowflakes. Somewhere behind him, glass shattered. The heat became unbearable within seconds. Roof beams groaned overhead. Elias stumbled backward into the dirt as flames burst through the loft windows. The entire barn seemed to breathe fire at once. And then came the silence afterward. That terrible silence only fire leaves behind. He stood in the mud nearly an hour later, staring at what remained of his life. The ranch house windows glowed red beneath collapsing timbers. Smoke drifted low across the property, mixing with the cold night wind and the smell of wet ash. Neighbors eventually arrived from miles away carrying lanterns and blankets, but none of them knew what to say to a man standing alone in front of ruin. Elias barely heard them anyway. His eyes stayed fixed on the porch where his wife used to sit every morning drinking coffee while sunrise rolled across the valley. Gone now. All of it gone. One of the men placed a careful hand on Elias's shoulder. Sheriff says maybe the storm caused it. Elias said nothing, because storms did not leave boot prints near the back fence. Storms did not cut water lines. And storms did not make a rancher feel watched even after the flames died. Hours later, while the last embers still cracked softly in the dark, Elias walked through the wreckage alone. His boots sank into black mud and soaked timber. Beneath a fallen shelf near the house, he spotted something half buried in ash. A Bible, burned along the edges. The leather blackened from heat. He stared at it for a long moment while smoke drifted past his face. Then slowly, almost gently, he threw it into the mud beside his feet. God can burn with the rest, he said quietly. The wind answered him with silence. But 3 days later, down near the frozen river outside Black Hollow Creek, Elias Whitmore would find something the fire forgot to take from him. The river outside Black Hollow Creek moved slow that morning, dark water pushing between sheets of cracked ice, while cold winds swept across the valley hard enough to sting a man's eyes. Elias Whitmore rode without direction, shoulders low beneath his weathered coat, letting the reins hang loose in his hands while his horse followed the frozen bank. 3 days had passed since the fire. 3 days since the smell of smoke buried itself into his skin so deeply he could no longer tell if it came from the world around him or from somewhere inside his chest. He had not slept more than an hour at a time. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw orange light moving behind windows that no longer existed. He heard roof beams splitting apart, heard horses screaming in panic. Worst of all, he heard silence afterward, the kind that settles over a man when grief finally grows too heavy for tears. Snow clouds drifted low across the Wyoming sky, turning the morning gray and colorless. Elias stopped near a bend in the river where dead cottonwood branches leaned crooked over the water. His horse suddenly snorted and pulled sideways. Something floated near the rocks downstream. At first, Elias thought it was driftwood caught against the ice. Then he saw dark hair moving with the current. He slid from the saddle immediately, boots crunching through frozen mud as he hurried toward the riverbank. The water there ran deep and fast beneath the ice shelves, cold enough to kill a man in minutes. The woman looked nearly lifeless where the current had trapped her against the stones. White dress soaked through, one sleeve torn near the shoulder, skin pale from the cold, but her hand still gripped something tightly against her chest. Elias waded into the freezing water without thinking. The cold cut through his boots instantly, sharp as broken glass. He grabbed her beneath the arms and pulled her carefully toward shore while icy water soaked into his coat. She barely weighed anything. 20 feet from the riverbank, she coughed weakly against his shoulder. Alive. Elias carried her to dry ground and laid her beside the horse. Her lips trembled from the cold, but her fingers refused to release the silver cross hanging from a thin chain around her neck. Even unconscious, she held on to it like it was the only thing left keeping her tethered to this world. Elias stared down at the cross for a long moment. Strange thing to notice, but it looked untouched by the river. Clean silver against wet fabric and ash-gray morning light. He wrapped his blanket around her and glanced toward the empty hills surrounding the creek. No wagon tracks. No nearby riders. No sign anyone had come searching for her, which only made the situation feel worse somehow. People did not simply appear half-frozen in the middle of nowhere. Not this far west. Not alone. His first instinct told him to leave her at the church in town and ride away before trouble followed. But then the woman stirred faintly beneath the blanket. Her eyes opened only halfway, green and unfocused beneath damp strands of hair. Fear crossed her face instantly. Not confusion. Not pain. Fear. She grabbed Elias by the sleeve with surprising strength. "Do not let them find me," she whispered. Her voice sounded raw from cold and exhaustion. Elias frowned slightly. Who? But her eyes had already closed again. The wind carried silence across the riverbank. Somewhere far off, a raven cried through the gray sky. Elias looked down at the stranger in his arms, then back toward the distant smoke still rising from the ruins of his ranch nearly 12 miles away. Trouble. That was all this could be. The kind that arrived quiet and stayed permanent. Yet when he lifted her onto his horse and turned toward home, Elias Whitmore realized something that unsettled him more than the freezing river ever could. For the first time since the fire, he no longer felt completely alone. The cabin smelled like wet ash, old pine wood, and coffee grounds burned too long over the stove. Elias Whitmore pushed open the crooked front door with his shoulder while cold wind followed him inside from the valley. Snow had started falling lightly across Black Hollow Creek by then, thin white flakes drifting through the gray afternoon sky and settling over the black scars left by the fire. The woman remained motionless beneath the blanket across his horse, her dark hair damp against the wool. Elias cleared a chair aside with one boot and carefully lifted her into the small bed near the fireplace. The mattress creaked softly beneath her weight. For a moment, he simply stood there looking at her. She did not belong in a place like this. Not in a burned rancher's cabin where smoke stains still covered half the walls and one side of the ceiling remained black from the fire. Her face looked too clean somehow, even covered in river water and exhaustion. Like she belonged in some Eastern church painted onto Christmas cards wealthy people mailed during winter. Elias frowned at the thought and turned away immediately. Trouble always arrived pretty before it became expensive. He tossed another split log into the fire. Sparks drifted upward through the chimney while orange light spread slowly across the cabin walls. Outside, the Wyoming wind groaned against the shutters. Inside, everything felt painfully quiet. Too quiet. Elias had spent years loving silence out here. Now it pressed against him like weight. He filled a kettle from the water bucket and set it near the flames. His hands moved automatically through old routines while his thoughts stayed fixed on the stranger breathing softly behind him. Every few minutes, he glanced toward the window, toward the hills, toward the empty white landscape beyond the ranch. Waiting. That was the problem with trouble. It rarely traveled alone. Nearly an hour passed before the woman finally stirred. A small movement beneath the blanket. Then another. Elias sat quietly in the wooden chair across the room, rifle resting beside his boots. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first beneath the firelight. Green. Bright even through exhaustion. She looked around the cabin with confusion before panic suddenly tightened her face. Her hand moved instantly toward the silver cross hanging at her neck. Still there. Only then did she breathe again. Easy, Elias said calmly. His voice sounded rough from disuse. You are safe for now. The woman pushed herself upright too quickly and winced faintly. Elias noticed bruises along one wrist where the wet sleeve had slipped back slightly. Not fresh, but recent enough to make his jaw tighten. She noticed him watching and immediately pulled the blanket higher. Silence settled between them again. Fire crackled softly nearby while snow tapped against the window glass. Finally she spoke. "Where am I? My ranch. Or what is left of it?" Her eyes drifted toward the blackened ceiling beams overhead. She seemed to understand the rest without asking. "You pulled me from the river?" Elias nodded once. "Why?" Strange question. Most people asked how long they had been unconscious. Or where their horse was. Not why. Elias leaned back slightly in the chair. Did not seem right leaving somebody there to freeze. She lowered her eyes after that. Her fingers tightened around the silver cross again. Elias noticed faint engraving across the metal when the firelight hit it. Letters too small to read from where he sat. Expensive piece, though. Real silver. Not the kind poor travelers carried through Wyoming territory alone. "You got a name?" he asked after a while. The woman hesitated long enough for Elias to notice. "Clara," she finally answered softly. "Clara Belmore." The name sounded Eastern. Refined. Like piano music and expensive carpets. Not mud roads and cattle country. Elias studied her quietly for another moment. "People looking for you, Miss Belmore?" Clara's expression changed instantly. Fear crossed her face so fast she could not hide it. Not fear of him. Fear of someone else. Someone close. Somewhere beyond those snow-covered hills. Before she could answer, the sound of distant hoofbeats echoed faintly across the valley outside. Elias stood immediately. Clara's breathing stopped altogether. And for the first time since entering the cabin, Elias Whitmore saw genuine terror in her eyes. The hoofbeats outside the cabin slowed against the frozen ground, steady and deliberate beneath the falling snow. Elias Whitmore moved toward the window without a sound, one hand already resting near the rifle leaning beside the door. Across the room, Clara Belmore sat frozen on the edge of the bed, both hands wrapped tightly around the silver cross hanging at her throat. The fire cracked softly between them while cold wind rattled the loose shutters. Elias pulled the curtain aside just enough to look outside. One rider. Older man. Thick coat dusted white with snow. Not trouble. At least not the kind Clara feared. "Relax," Elias muttered quietly. "Just old man Carter from the North Ridge." Clara did not relax. Her eyes remained fixed toward the window, as if expecting something far worse to appear through the storm. A moment later came the knock. 3 slow hits against the cabin door. Elias opened it halfway while icy air rushed inside, carrying the smell of snow and horse leather. Walter Carter stood outside, holding a sack of supplies beneath one arm. His gray beard looked half-frozen. "Thought you might need coffee," the old rancher said. "And maybe somebody reminding you to eat." Elias gave a faint nod and stepped aside. Walter entered slowly, stomping snow from his boots before his eyes drifted toward the woman near the fire. He stopped immediately. Surprise crossed his face first. Then concern. Clara lowered her gaze beneath the attention. Walter removed his gloves carefully. "Did not know you had company." "Neither did I," Elias answered dryly. Walter studied the burned cabin around them before setting the supply sack onto the table. The old man had known Elias nearly 15 years. Long enough to understand silence better than most people understood words. His eyes moved from Clara to the soaked blanket drying near the fire, then to the silver cross hanging around her neck. Something about that cross seemed to catch his attention, though he said nothing. Clara shifted uneasily beneath his stare. Elias noticed. "Found her near Black Hollow Creek," he explained. "River almost took her." Walter frowned slightly at that. "Nobody travels alone out there this time of year. That makes 2 of us wondering why she was there." Clara finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "I was headed west." Walter gave a slow nod, though his expression suggested he did not entirely believe her. West usually has a reason attached to it. Silence settled over the room again. Outside, snow thickened across the valley, covering black earth and burned fence posts beneath clean white layers. Elias poured coffee into 3 chipped tin cups while Walter warmed his hands near the fire. The cabin felt smaller somehow, with another person inside. Tighter. More watchful. Finally Walter glanced toward Elias. "Sheriff stopped by town this morning." Elias looked up immediately. "And?" "Asking questions about your fire." Elias's jaw tightened. "Questions or conclusions?" Walter hesitated just long enough to answer honestly. Some folks think maybe you said it yourself for insurance. Clara's eyes lifted sharply toward Elias. He said nothing, just stared into the dark coffee steaming in his cup. Walter sighed heavily. I told them they were fools. Does not matter. Elias leaned back slowly in the chair. Town already decided what kind of man I am long before the fire. Clara studied him quietly after that. There was no anger in his voice. That was the unsettling part. Just exhaustion. The kind that settles deep inside. Somebody after too many disappointments. Walter eventually rose to leave as daylight faded outside the windows. Before opening the door, the old rancher paused beside Elias. You be careful who you trust out here. His eyes drifted briefly toward Clara, though not cruelly. Only cautious. Then he stepped back into the storm. The cabin door closed again. Silence returned with it. Firelight flickered softly across the walls while wind groaned through the valley outside. Clara stared into the flames for a long moment before speaking. You think I am lying? Elias sat across from her, shoulders heavy beneath the dim lantern glow. I think people running from something usually bring it with them. Clara lowered her eyes. And yet you still brought me here. Elias looked toward the burned ceiling beams above them. Then toward the Bible, still lying half-ruined near the fireplace bricks where he had tossed it days earlier. Maybe I stopped making smart decisions after the fire. Clara followed his gaze toward the burned Bible. Her expression softened slightly. You used to believe. Elias gave a faint bitter smile without humor. Used to own a lot of things. The fire cracked sharply between them. Then somewhere far beyond the cabin walls, hidden deep within the snowstorm rolling across Black Hollow Creek, another set of distant hoofbeats echoed through the dark. The second set of hoofbeats never came closer. They lingered somewhere beyond the hills for less than a minute before fading back into the storm like ghosts swallowed by snow. Elias Whitmore remained seated near the fire long after the sound disappeared, listening carefully while cold wind rattled the cabin walls. Across the room, Clara Belmore sat wrapped in an old wool blanket, her green eyes fixed toward the dark windows. Neither of them spoke. Out on the Wyoming plains, silence often meant safety, but sometimes silence meant somebody watching from far enough away to stay unseen. The fire burned lower as midnight crept across Black Hollow Creek. Elias finally stood and added another log to the flames. Orange light spread across the cabin again, warming the rough pine walls and the scars left by smoke above. The ceiling beams. Clara watched him quietly. You do not sleep much, do you? She asked softly. Elias brushed ash from his hands. Sleep stopped helping a while ago. She lowered her gaze after that. There was something careful about the way she moved. Careful with her words. Careful with every glance. Like somebody who had learned long ago that saying the wrong thing could cost more than pride. Elias noticed she still wore the same damp clothes from the river beneath the blanket. The realization bothered him more than expected. Without a word, he crossed the cabin toward an old cedar chest near the wall and opened it slowly. Inside rested belongings untouched since the fire. Folded fabric. A woman's coat. A few dresses carefully preserved beneath smoke and ash. Elias stood there longer than necessary before pulling out a plain cream-colored sweater. He carried it across the room and held it toward Clara without meeting her eyes. It belonged to my wife, he said quietly. You will freeze otherwise. Clara hesitated before accepting it gently with both hands. Thank you. Her voice nearly disappeared beneath the crackling fire. Elias turned away immediately, staring out the window while she changed behind the blanket near the bed. Snow drifted heavily across the ranch outside, covering burned fence posts and blackened earth beneath soft white layers. Strange thing about snow. It tried to make ruined places look peaceful again. A few minutes later, Clara stepped carefully toward the fire wearing the oversized sweater. The sleeves covered half her hands. Elias glanced back once and quickly looked away again. Not because of beauty, though she had plenty of that. It was something else. The sight of another living soul wearing warmth inside this cabin after days of emptiness unsettled him in ways he did not understand. Clara moved closer to the fireplace and noticed the burned Bible resting near the bricks. Carefully, she bent down and picked it up from the floor. Ash flaked softly from the cracked leather cover. You should not leave this on the ground, she murmured. Elias leaned against the wall, arms folded. It survived the fire better than the rest of us. Clara opened the Bible gently despite the damaged pages. Most of the middle had blackened from heat, but portions remained readable near the edges. She brushed soot carefully from one page with her thumb. My mother used to say damaged things still carry meaning. Elias gave a tired half-smile. Your mother clearly never met Wyoming weather. To his surprise, Clara laughed softly. Not loud, not dramatic. Just one small laugh that seemed almost forgotten before it escaped her. The sound lingered strangely inside the cabin afterward. Warm. Human. Elias realized then it had been months since he heard laughter inside these walls. Maybe longer. Clara noticed a tear in the burned curtain beside the window and walked over to straighten it slightly. While adjusting the fabric, her sleeve slipped back just enough for Elias to see something dark along her wrist. A mark. Circular. Burned into the skin. Clara quickly pulled the sleeve down again the moment she noticed him looking. Too quickly. Elias straightened slightly from the wall. What happened to your arm? Clara's face lost all warmth instantly. Nothing. That did not look like nothing. Silence. Fire crackling. Wind outside. Then Clara stepped backward from the window slowly, one hand gripping the silver cross against her chest again. Some things follow you, she whispered. No matter how far west you run. Elias studied her for a long moment beneath the lantern light. Then slowly, without another word, he walked toward the cabin door and slid the heavy bolt firmly into place for the night. Because deep down, somewhere beneath the grief and ash still buried inside him, Elias Whitmore had begun to understand something dangerous. Whoever Clara Belmore was running from had not stopped looking. Morning arrived quietly over Black Hollow Creek. Snow covered the valley in pale silver light, while smoke drifted lazily from the cabin chimney into the freezing Wyoming air. Elias Whitmore had been awake since before sunrise, sitting outside beneath the porch roof with a tin cup of black coffee warming his hands. The world looked softer after snow. Burned fence posts no longer resembled broken bones scattered across the ranch. Even the black scars left by the fire seemed gentler beneath fresh white powder. But Elias knew better than to trust appearances. Snow only covered damage. It never erased it. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open softly. Clara Belmore stepped outside wrapped in the cream-colored sweater and one of Elias's old wool coats hanging loosely over her shoulders. The morning wind pushed strands of dark hair across her face immediately. She paused beside the doorway, looking out across the ruined ranch in silence. Elias noticed the sadness in her expression before she hit it. Most people stared at destruction with curiosity. Clara looked at it like she understood it. You should be inside, Elias said quietly. Cold enough to freeze river water solid this morning. Clara stepped closer anyway, holding the coat tighter around herself. I have seen colder winters back east. Elias raised an eyebrow slightly. Back east usually comes with walls thicker than this cabin. To his surprise, Clara smiled faintly. Small thing. Barely there. Yet somehow it changed the entire look of her face beneath the pale morning light. Elias looked away first. Across the yard, half the old barn still stood blackened against the snowy hills. Elias had avoided going near it since the fire. Some losses felt easier at a distance. Clara followed his gaze. Will you rebuild it? She asked softly. Elias took a slow drink from his coffee before answering. Takes more than wood to rebuild a home. Silence settled gently between them after that. Not uncomfortable this time. Just quiet. Somewhere beyond the hills, a hawk cried against the cold morning sky. Clara eventually noticed the pile of split firewood beside the porch. Without saying anything, she walked over and began stacking the pieces neatly beneath the awning where snow could not reach them. Elias frowned slightly. You do not have to do that. Clara kept working. You saved my life. Still does not make you ranch help. Maybe I am tired of feeling useless. That answer lingered between them longer than expected. Elias watched her carefully for a moment. Her hands moved with surprising familiarity around rough, wood, and heavy logs. Not delicate, not spoiled. Whatever life Clara Belmore came from, it had taught her more than ballroom manners and church hymns. The thought unsettled him again. Around midday, Elias saddled his horse for town. Supplies were running low, and the cabin would not survive another week of snow without proper lumber and feed. Clara stood near the porch while he tightened the saddle straps. I can come with you, she offered quietly. Elias shook his head immediately. Town talks enough already. Clara lowered her eyes. Because of me? Elias hesitated before answering honestly. Because people fear what they do not understand. He regretted the words the moment he saw her expression change. Not anger. Hurt. Real hurt. Clara nodded once and stepped back toward the cabin door without another word. Elias watched her disappear inside while cold wind rolled across the valley. For a long moment, he considered apologizing. But men like Elias Whitmore were not built for apologies. They were built for surviving hard winters and burying difficult feelings beneath silence. Nothing more. By late afternoon, he returned from town beneath darkening skies. The moment he stepped inside the cabin, something felt different. Warmth greeted him first. Not from the fire. From the room itself. The broken curtain beside the window had been repaired neatly with fresh stitching. Ash swept from the floorboards. Lantern glass cleaned clear. And sitting near the fireplace was the burned Bible, carefully dusted free of soot and placed upright beside a small wildflower in an old tin cup. Elias stopped in the doorway staring at it. Clara glanced up from the stove where she stirred soup quietly. "I hope you do not mind," she said softly. Elias removed his hat slowly, snow melting from the brim onto the floorboards. His eyes remained fixed on the Bible. Most people would have thrown that thing away. Clara looked toward the firelight dancing across the damaged leather cover. Some things deserve a second chance. Elias said nothing after that. But later that night, long after Clara had fallen asleep beside the fire, he reached out quietly and pulled the burned Bible closer instead of leaving it. On the floor, for the first time since the fire, the cabin no longer felt like a graveyard. Elias Whitmore noticed it 3 mornings later while standing at the kitchen table, sharpening a rusted hunting knife beneath the soft glow of sunrise. The place still smelled faintly of smoke and charred pine, but now there was coffee brewing on the stove, fresh bread cooling beside the window, a blanket folded neatly across the chair near the fireplace. Small things, quiet things, the kind a lonely man stopped expecting after enough years passed. Outside, Wyoming winter stretched cold and endless across the valley. Snow covered the hills surrounding Black Hollow Creek in rolling white silence, while dark evergreens swayed beneath hard wind. Elias buttoned his coat and stepped onto the porch carrying a bucket for water. Before he reached the well, he paused. Clara Belmore stood near the remains of the old barn with her back turned toward him, staring at the burned beams rising from the snow like black skeletons against the pale morning sky. She had wrapped a wool scarf around her hair against the wind, but strands still escaped across her face. For several seconds, she simply stood there motionless. Not frightened, not sad, just lost inside thought somewhere far away from Wyoming. Elias approached slowly through the snow. "You keep staring at that barn like it owes you money." Clara glanced back over her shoulder, surprised by the sound of his voice. Then she smiled faintly. "I was trying to imagine what this place looked like before." Elias followed her gaze toward the wreckage. "Looked alive." His answer came quiet and flat. Clara stepped closer to one of the burned fence posts sticking from the snow. "You built all this yourself?" "Most of it. That must have taken years." Elias nodded once. "Funny thing about years. They disappear fast." Wind swept across the valley hard enough to send loose snow drifting around their boots. Clara studied the ranch again carefully. "You love this place." Elias looked toward the distant mountains beneath the gray winter sky. "Still do." That answer surprised even him. Clara noticed. She said nothing afterward. Some people filled silence because they feared it. Clara seemed to understand silence carried weight all its own. Later that afternoon, Elias rode into town for lumber nails and horse feed, while Clara stayed behind at the cabin. Black Hollow Creek looked colder than usual beneath overcast skies. Smoke rose from chimneys across the muddy main street, while townsfolk hurried between shops with collars raised against the wind. Elias noticed the stares immediately when he entered Mercer's general store. Not cruel exactly. Curious. Suspicious. Ranchers had long memories out west, especially regarding fire and bad luck. Old man Mercer leaned across the counter while weighing coffee beans. "Heard you got company staying out there now." Elias kept his attention on the supply shelves. "Town talks too much." Mercer chuckled softly. "Town gets bored easy during winter." But Elias noticed something else beneath the humor. Unease. The shopkeeper lowered his voice slightly. 3 strangers came through yesterday, asking questions." Elias looked up slowly. "Questions about what?" "About a woman." The air inside the store suddenly felt colder. Mercer wiped his hands carefully against his apron before continuing. "Said she had dark hair, green eyes, carried a silver cross. Elias's jaw tightened. You tell them anything? Told them strangers do not survive long around here unless folks trust them. Mercer hesitated before adding quietly. Those men did not look like they were asking out of kindness. Elias bought the supplies and left town without another word. By the time he returned to the ranch, snow had started falling again in thick, white waves across the valley. He spotted Clara immediately near the porch, kneeling beside a wooden crate while gathering split logs for the fire. Then he saw it. Horse tracks in the snow. Fresh. 3 sets leading from the ridge above the property down toward the cabin before turning back west. Elias slid from the saddle fast enough to startle Clara. What happened? He asked sharply. Clara stood slowly, confusion crossing her face. Nothing. Elias pointed toward the tracks. You see anybody here? Clara looked toward the ridge. The color drained from her face. Instantly. No, she whispered. Elias followed her stare uphill toward the fading line of tracks disappearing into the snowfall. One of the prints carried a strange mark pressed deep beside the heel. Circular, burned into the leather sole itself. Clara's breathing became uneven beside him. Then softly, almost to herself, she whispered words Elias wished he had not heard. They found me. Snow fell harder after sunset, thick white sheets drifting across Black Hollow Creek until the entire valley disappeared beneath darkness and storm. Inside the cabin, firelight flickered softly against the walls while wind groaned through the trees outside like distant voices. Elias Whitmore stood near the window watching the ridge where the horse tracks had vanished hours earlier. They were gone now beneath fresh snow, but he could still picture them clearly in his mind. 3 riders. Heavy horses. 1 marked boot print burned into the sole. Clara sat quietly beside the fire wrapped in the wool blanket, her hands trembling slightly around a cup of untouched coffee. She had barely spoken since seeing the tracks. The silver cross at her throat caught the lantern glow every time she moved. Elias finally turned from the window. You going to tell me who they are? Clara lowered her eyes. Silence stretched between them while logs cracked softly in the fire. Then she spoke so quietly Elias almost missed it. Men my father trusted once. Elias frowned slightly. Trusted men do not usually hunt women across 2 states. Clara gave a tired smile, without humor. That is because my father trusted money more than people. The wind slammed lightly against the cabin wall outside. Elias pulled another chair closer to the fire and sat across from her. Start from the beginning. Clara stared into the flames for a long moment before speaking again. My father owned rail land back east. Thanks to. He made deals with powerful men from Denver, Cheyenne, even St. Louis. Elias listened without interrupting. Clara's voice remained calm, but her fingers tightened harder around the coffee cup with every sentence. At first he thought they were buying ranch land legally. Small towns, cattle routes, places nobody important noticed. She paused. Then families started disappearing. Elias's expression hardened slightly. Disappearing how? Clara shook her head faintly. Their homes burned. Records vanished. Men sold land they never intended to sell because somebody frightened them badly enough. The fire snapped sharply between them. Elias looked toward the burned ceiling beams overhead without meaning to. Clara noticed immediately. My father found documents proving everything, she continued softly. Names, payments, ranch locations, including one near Black Hollow Creek. Elias leaned forward slowly. Mine. Clara nodded once. I think your fire was meant to erase ownership records hidden nearby. Silence filled the cabin after that. Heavy silence. The kind that settles into a room once truth finally arrives. Elias stared down at his rough hands resting against his knees. For days he had suspected the fire was no accident. But hearing it spoken aloud changed something inside him. Made it real. Clara carefully reached into the pocket of her coat and removed a folded piece of paper tied with faded ribbon. The edges looked damp and worn from travel. My father gave me this before I ran, she whispered. Said if anything happened to him, I was to take it west to a federal judge in Cheyenne. Elias accepted the paper slowly. He did not open it yet. Somehow the weight alone already told him enough. Where is your father now? Clara's eyes filled briefly with sadness she fought hard to hide. I do not know. Elias looked toward the storm outside again. And these men chasing you. Clara swallowed carefully before answering. One of them worked directly for my father for nearly 10 years. His name is Warren Pike. The moment she spoke the name, something inside Elias shifted. He had heard it before. Quiet conversations in town saloons. Railroad rumors. Land disputes settled through fear instead of courts. Men rarely said the name loudly. Clara noticed the recognition in his face immediately. You know him? Elias nodded once. Enough. The cabin suddenly felt smaller than before. Colder too, despite the fire. Clara stared into the flames, voice barely above a whisper now. I thought if I came far enough west, maybe God would hide me somewhere nobody would think to look. Elias looked toward the burned Bible resting beside the fireplace bricks, then toward the snowstorms swallowing the valley beyond the windows. Out here, he said quietly, God is not the only thing people stop believing in. Clara lowered her eyes after that. For several minutes neither of them spoke. Then somewhere outside beyond the storm, a horse whinnied softly in the darkness. Not far away this time. Close enough for both of them to hear it clearly. The horse outside the cabin did not move for several seconds. It simply stood somewhere beyond the snowstorm, breathing heavily in the dark while wind swept across the valley. Inside, neither Elias Whitmore nor Clara Belmore spoke. The fire crackled softly between them, throwing long shadows across the walls blackened by smoke and winter. Elias slowly rose from his chair and reached for the rifle leaning near the door. Clara stood immediately. Please, she whispered. Do not go outside. Elias glanced toward her briefly while checking the chamber with calm hands. If somebody rode this close in weather like this, they already know we are here. Clara's face tightened with fear. Not panic. Worse. Recognition. Elias noticed it again. Whatever haunted her had a shape now. A name. Warren Pike. And suddenly the danger surrounding his ranch no longer felt distant or imagined. Another sound came through the storm. Not hoofbeats this time. A voice. Faint beneath the wind. Whitmore. Elias frowned slightly. He knew that voice. He opened the door carefully while snow blew hard into the cabin. Walter Carter sat atop a dark horse near the porch holding a lantern against the storm. His beard looked frozen solid beneath the yellow light. You alone? Elias called out. Walter nodded quickly. Need a word. Elias stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind him before Clara could follow. Snow crunched beneath his boots while cold wind bit through his coat immediately. Walter leaned lower in the saddle. 3 men came through town again tonight, he said quietly, asking more questions. Elias rested one hand against the porch rail. About Clara? Walter's eyes narrowed slightly at the name. So she finally told you. Elias said nothing. Walter glanced toward the cabin windows glowing warmly behind them. Those men are staying at the old mining cabins near Dry Creek Ridge. Sheriff says they claim to be railroad agents. And you believe that? Walter gave a dry laugh. Son, I have known railroad agents. They smell like cigars and paperwork. These men smell like winter trouble. Snow whipped across the ranch hard enough to blur the hills behind them. Walter lowered his voice further. One of them asked specifically about your fire. Elias's jaw tightened slowly. What exactly did he ask? Whether you found anything strange in the ruins afterward. Elias looked toward the darkness beyond the valley, toward the buried remains of his ranch beneath layers of snow. Suddenly, the folded papers Clara carried felt heavier than before. Walter studied him carefully. You need to decide something soon. What is that? Whether this woman is worth dying over. The words hung between them beneath the storm. Elias did not answer immediately, because the truth unsettled him more than Walter realized. 3 weeks ago, Elias Whitmore would have walked away from all of this without hesitation. He had already lost nearly everything a man could lose. But somewhere between the frozen river and the repaired curtains hanging inside that cabin, something had changed. Clara had brought warmth back into rooms he thought would stay cold forever. That frightened him more than armed men ever could. Walter sighed heavily. I will keep my eyes open in town. Elias nodded once. Appreciate it. The old rancher turned his horse back toward the storm before pausing one last time. And Elias? Yeah. Walter looked toward the cabin windows glowing softly through falling snow. Sometimes the Lord sends broken people to each other on purpose. Then he rode off into the dark. Elias stood alone outside several moments longer while snow gathered across his shoulders. The wind carried silence again after Walter disappeared. But not peaceful silence. Waiting silence. When Elias finally stepped back inside the cabin, warmth wrapped around him immediately. Clara stood near the fire, clutching the silver cross at her throat. Her eyes searched his face before he even spoke. They are close, are they not? Elias removed his gloves slowly. Closer than I would like. Clara lowered her gaze. Then I should leave before morning. The words hit harder than Elias expected. He set the rifle quietly against the wall. You leave this ranch alone in weather like this, you will not make 5 miles. If I stay, they may destroy what little you have left. Elias looked around the cabin. Burned walls. Broken ceiling beams. Smoke stains that refused to wash away. Then his eyes drifted toward the Bible resting carefully beside the fireplace where Clara had placed it days earlier. Strange thing was, the cabin no longer looked ruined to him. Not completely. Elias met her eyes across the firelight. Trouble already found this place before you ever did. Clara stared at him silently. Snow hissed softly against the windows outside, while flames danced low between them. Then Elias stepped toward the table and placed one rough hand over the folded papers she had given him earlier. Tomorrow, he said quietly, you are going to tell me everything Warren Pike is after. The storm finally broke sometime before dawn. By morning, the Wyoming sky stretched pale and clear above Black Hollow Creek, while fresh snow glittered across the valley like crushed glass beneath the sun. Smoke drifted lazily from the cabin chimney. Inside, the warmth from the fire mixed with the smell of coffee and pine wood. Elias Whitmore sat at the table, turning Clara Belmore's folded papers carefully between his rough hands. He had not opened them yet. Somehow the sealed ribbon still felt like the last fragile barrier between his old life and whatever waited ahead. Clara stood near the stove, quietly stirring oatmeal inside a cast-iron pot. The silence between them no longer felt uneasy. It felt heavy, like both of them understood the truth sitting in that room had finally grown too large to avoid. Elias looked toward her. You said your father uncovered names. Clara nodded slowly. Land brokers. Railroad investors. Men. Buying ranch property through fear instead of contracts. Elias untied the ribbon carefully. And Warren Pike worked for them. Warren Pike worked for whoever paid him enough. Elias unfolded the papers at last. Several official documents covered in legal stamps rested inside alongside maps of rail lines stretching through Wyoming territory. Certain ranches had been circled in dark ink. One of them sat directly beside Black Hollow Creek. Elias stared at his own property, marked there in silence. These papers prove ownership fraud, Clara explained quietly. Families forced off land. Ranches burned after refusing to sell. Records changed afterward to hide it. Elias studied another page showing signatures beneath railroad contracts. Why would anybody care about this valley so much? Clara stepped closer to the table. Because the new Western Rail route may pass through here within 2 years. Elias leaned back slowly. Suddenly everything made terrible sense. The fire. The questions in town. The strangers riding through snowstorms searching for Clara. Land became gold once railroads arrived. And men chasing gold rarely cared who suffered beneath their boots. Clara rested one hand lightly against the table edge. My father planned to testify before federal investigators in Cheyenne. Elias looked up. Planned. Clara lowered her eyes. The night before I escaped, men came to our home in Denver. Her voice stayed calm, but Elias noticed the way her fingers tightened against the wood. My father gave me these papers and told me to run west. He said if the truth survived, maybe innocent people still had a chance. Outside, wind brushed softly across the cabin roof, while sunlight spilled through the repaired curtains Clara had sewn days earlier. Elias glanced toward the burned Bible near the fireplace. Funny thing was, 2 weeks ago he would have thrown those papers into the fire and told the world to solve its own problems. Grief had emptied him too completely to care about justice anymore. But now Clara stood inside his ruined cabin speaking about innocent families losing homes the same way he lost his. And somehow that mattered. More than he wanted it to. Clara noticed his silence. You regret bringing me here. Elias shook his head once. No, the answer came faster than expected. Honest to. Clara looked surprised by it. Elias folded the papers carefully again. I regret that men like Pike exist at all. A faint smile touched Clara's face before fading just as quickly. My father used to say the West reveals what kind of man somebody truly is. Elias gave a tired half-laugh. Then your father never met ranchers during winter. Clara smiled again, this time longer. The sight caught Elias off guard enough to make him look away toward the window. Outside, Sunlight reflected across untouched snow while horses moved slowly near the broken fence line. Peaceful scene. Yet beneath it lingered tension neither of them could ignore. Clara walked quietly toward the fireplace and picked up the burned Bible resting near the hearth. She brushed her fingers carefully along the damaged leather cover. "Can I ask you something?" Elias nodded slightly. Clara looked toward him with surprising softness in her eyes. "After the fire, did you hate God?" Elias stared at the flames for a long moment before answering. No, Clara waited quietly. Elias rubbed one rough hand across his jaw. Hating somebody means you still expect them to answer. The fire cracked softly between them. Clara lowered her gaze toward the Bible in her hands. "When they threw me into that river, I thought I was going to die." Elias looked up slowly. "I prayed anyway." Her voice barely rose above the firelight now. "I asked God for one small miracle before the water took me." Silence filled the cabin. Then Clara met his eyes fully for the first time since arriving at the ranch. "And the next thing I saw was you." Elias felt something tighten unexpectedly inside his chest. Not fear. Something quieter. More dangerous. He looked away first, toward the sunlight stretching across the snow outside the window. "Careful, Miss Belmore," he said softly. "You might start making me believe in miracles too." But neither of them noticed the rider watching the cabin from the distant ridge beyond the valley. The rider remained on the ridge until sunset. Elias Whitmore spotted him, just once through the cabin window while hauling water from the well. A dark figure on horseback, standing motionless against the fading Wyoming sky. Too far away to recognize. Too still to be harmless. By the time Elias reached for the rifle hanging beside the door, the rider had already disappeared behind the snowy hills west of Black Hollow Creek. Clara noticed the change in his face immediately when he stepped back inside. They were watching again. It was not a question. Elias removed his gloves slowly. "Yeah." Clara lowered her eyes toward the floorboards. For several moments, the only sound inside the cabin came from wind brushing softly against the roof and the steady crackle of firewood burning low in the hearth. Then Elias crossed the room and began pulling old saddlebags from beneath the table. Clara looked up sharply. "What are you doing?" "Preparing." Elias checked cartridges carefully before placing them into the worn leather bag. His movements stayed calm, methodical, like a man long familiar with difficult winters and harder choices. Clara stepped closer. "You cannot fight men like Warren Pike alone." Elias glanced toward her briefly. "Who said anything about fighting?" "Then what are you planning?" Elias tied the saddlebag shut. "Tomorrow morning we leave for Cheyenne." Clara stared at him in disbelief. "In this weather?" "Snow slows everybody equally." He rested one hand against the folded papers inside the bag. "Those documents need reaching a federal courtroom before Pike gets close enough to bury them permanently." Clara looked toward the windows where darkness slowly swallowed the valley outside. "Cheyenne is nearly 100 miles from here. Closer to 90 if we cut through Elk Pass." Clara shook her head immediately. "That trail is dangerous during winter." Elias gave a faint, tired smile. "So is staying here." Silence settled again between them. Clara watched him carefully while firelight flickered across his weathered face. Something about Elias Whitmore unsettled her now in a different way. When she first arrived at the ranch, grief had hollowed him out almost completely. He moved like a man surviving out of habit rather than purpose. But somewhere during these quiet days beneath falling snow, purpose had returned. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to place strength back into his shoulders again. Clara noticed it every time he looked toward the ruined barn outside. Every time he touched the burned Bible beside the fireplace instead of ignoring it. "You barely know me," she said softly. Elias paused near the table. "Know enough." Clara stepped closer to the firelight. "If Pike catches us carrying those papers, he will ruin you too." Elias looked around the cabin slowly. Burned walls. Smoke scars. Half-repaired windows. Pretty sure he already tried. Clara almost smiled at that before sadness returned again. "I never meant to bring this to your doorstep." Elias rested both hands against the table edge and looked toward her fully. "Funny thing about storms, Miss Belmore." His voice stayed low and steady. "They do not ask permission before arriving." Clara held his gaze longer this time. Long enough for something unspoken to pass quietly between them. Not romance. Not yet. Something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. Two lonely souls standing inside a broken cabin realizing they no longer carried their burdens entirely alone. The moment ended when somebody knocked against the cabin door. 3 sharp hits. Both of them froze instantly. Elias reached for the rifle without hesitation, while Clara's hand flew toward the silver cross at her throat. Another knock followed. "Whitmore," came Walter Carter's voice through the door. Elias exhaled quietly and opened it. Walter stepped inside, carrying snow across his boots and urgency across his face. "You got trouble," the old rancher muttered immediately. Elias closed the door behind him. "What happened?" Walter removed his gloves quickly. "Sheriff got drunk tonight over at Miller's saloon. Started talking too much." Elias frowned. "About what?" Walter glanced toward Clara before lowering his voice. "About a payment somebody offered for information leading to a dark-haired woman traveling west." Clara's face turned pale. Walter continued grimly. $500. Elias whistled softly beneath his breath. $500 could buy half the struggling ranches in Black Hollow Creek. Enough money to make desperate men forget morality real fast. Walter looked directly at Elias now. "Town will start searching by morning." The fire crackled low behind them, while cold wind rattled the cabin walls outside. Elias slowly nodded once. "Then we leave before sunrise." Clara looked between both men, fear tightening in her eyes again. "You still do not understand Warren Pike," she whispered. "He does not stop once he decides something belongs to him." Elias picked up the saddlebags calmly and slung them over one shoulder. Then he looked toward the burned Bible resting beside the fireplace bricks. "Maybe," he said quietly, "he has never met somebody with nothing left to lose." They left before first light touched the valley. The world outside Black Hollow Creek still slept beneath heavy snow while pale stars lingered above the Wyoming mountains like fading lanterns. Elias Whitmore tightened the saddle straps beside the porch while cold wind rolled through the ranch hard enough to sting exposed skin. Frost covered the broken fence lines and the burned remains of the barn in silver ice. Clara Belmore stepped carefully from the cabin carrying the folded blankets and supply satchel Walter Carter had brought during the night. She paused at the doorway for one long moment, looking back inside at the fire glowing low near the hearth. The repaired curtains, the wooden table, the burned Bible resting beside the fireplace bricks. Strange how quickly a place could begin feeling like home once kindness lived there. Elias noticed her hesitation while securing the horses. "We should move before sunrise." Clara nodded softly and crossed the snow toward him. Walter emerged from the darkness beside the stable carrying a lantern beneath his heavy coat. The old rancher looked exhausted, like he had not slept all night. "Sheriff already has men riding the eastern road," he muttered quietly. "You take Elk Pass, you might stay ahead of them till noon." Elias accepted the lantern and shook Walter's hand firmly. No speeches between men like them, just understanding. Walter glanced toward Clara afterward, his weathered face softening slightly. "You keep those papers safe, miss." Clara held the satchel tighter against her chest. "I will." Walter nodded once before looking back toward Elias. "And son?" Elias paused while pulling himself into the saddle. "Yeah." Walter glanced toward the burned ranch one final time. "Some things are worth rebuilding." The words lingered quietly in the frozen morning air after Walter stepped back into the shadows. Elias said nothing, but Clara noticed the way his eyes drifted briefly toward the cabin windows glowing faintly behind them. Then the two riders turned west into the snow. The trail through Elk Pass climbed slowly into the mountains where pine forests stretched dark and endless beneath winter sky. Snow creaked beneath the horses while icy winds swept through the trees carrying the sharp scent of cedar and frozen earth. For hours they rode mostly in silence. Not uncomfortable silence anymore. Familiar silence. The kind shared between two people carrying the same danger. Around midday they stopped beside a narrow creek half buried beneath ice. Elias dismounted first and handed Clara a tin cup of water melted over a small fire. Her cheeks had turned pink from cold beneath the wool scarf wrapped around her hair. "You have done this before," she said quietly while watching him tend the horses. Elias glanced up. "Done what?" "Run toward trouble instead of away from it." Elias gave a tired half-smile while brushing snow from his gloves. "Ranch life teaches a man stubbornness before wisdom." Clara looked down into the steaming cup between her hands. "My father used to say stubborn men either become legends or gravestones. Most become both eventually." To his surprise, Clara laughed softly again. The sound warmed something inside him more than the fire did. But the moment faded quickly when Elias noticed tracks ahead along the creek bed. Fresh. 3 riders at least. Maybe 4. Headed west. He crouched lower beside the snow, studying the impressions carefully. One carried the same circular mark burned into the heel. Clara saw it too. Her breathing caught immediately. Warren Pike. Elias rose slowly. Looks like they know where Elk Pass leads. Fear crossed Clara's face, but this time something else stood beside it. Guilt. This is my fault, she whispered. Elias looked toward the distant mountains where clouds gathered thick and gray again above the pass. No, his voice stayed calm and steady. Men like Pike choose what kind of monsters they become. Clara lowered her eyes. And what if he burns another ranch because of me? Elias stepped closer until only cold mountain air stood between them. Then he answers for all of them. Clara stared at him silently after that. Snow drifted softly around their boots while wind moved through the pine trees overhead with a low, mournful sound. Then Elias reached into his coat and pulled out the burned Bible wrapped carefully inside cloth. Clara looked surprised. Elias shrugged faintly. Figured maybe miracles deserve traveling protection. For the first time since Elias pulled her from the frozen river, Clara smiled without sadness hiding behind it. But high above the pass, unseen beyond the snow-covered ridge, 4 riders watched smoke from Elias's small fire rise into the winter sky. The snowstorm reached Elk Pass just before nightfall. Wind screamed through the mountain trail hard enough to shake the pine trees, while thick snow swirled across the narrow path ahead. Elias Whitmore rode slightly in front, one gloved hand steady on the reins while the other rested near the rifle strapped across his saddle. Clara Belmore followed close behind beneath layers of wool blankets and frost. The climb through the mountains had grown brutal during the last few miles. Ice coated the rocks beneath the horses. Visibility faded with every passing minute. Yet neither of them spoke about stopping, because somewhere behind them, Warren Pike kept coming. Elias finally spotted the old ranger station just before darkness swallowed the pass entirely. The small cabin leaned crooked against the mountainside beneath heavy snowdrifts, abandoned years earlier after a landslide closed the northern route. But smoke stains still marked the stone chimney. Shelter enough for one night. They tied the horses beneath the awning while snow hammered the roof overhead. Inside, the station smelled of dust, cedarwood, and old winters. Elias managed to coax fire from the ancient stove after several attempts while Clara spread blankets near the wall. Orange light slowly pushed back the darkness filling the room. For a few quiet minutes, neither of them moved. They simply listened to the storm outside and the crackling fire inside. Then Clara noticed blood along Elias's glove. Your hand. Elias looked down briefly. A deep crack split the skin across his knuckles from cold and rough rains. Nothing serious. Clara stepped closer anyway, carrying warm water from the stove. Sit down. Elias almost argued out of habit, but exhaustion finally won. He lowered himself carefully onto the wooden bench while Clara cleaned the cut with gentle hands. Outside, wind slammed against the cabin walls like waves against stone. Inside, silence settled soft and close between them. You know, Clara said quietly while wrapping cloth around his hand. Most men would have left me at that river. Elias watched the fire instead of her face. Most men had more sense than me. Clara smiled faintly. No, most men still had something left to protect. Elias finally looked toward her then. Firelight reflected softly in her green eyes while snow whispered against the windows behind her. You think I stopped protecting things after the fire, he said quietly. Clara hesitated. Did you? Elias stared down at the bandage around his hand. For several seconds, the only sound came from the storm outside. Then slowly he shook his head. Truth is, losing everything only showed me what mattered in the first place. Clara's eyes softened at those words. Neither noticed how close they stood now beneath the lantern glow. The moment broke when horses outside suddenly whinnied in panic. Elias stood instantly despite the pain in his hand. Clara moved toward the window. Through the swirling snow beyond the glass, dark figures appeared along the ridge above the ranger station. 4 riders, motionless against the storm, watching. Clara's face turned pale. Pike. Elias reached calmly for the rifle. Stay behind me. But before either of them could move further, one rider slowly descended toward the cabin. Alone. No weapon drawn. No shouting. Just steady hoofbeats approaching through the snow. The rider stopped 10 yards from the cabin porch and removed his hat beneath the storm. Older than Elias expected. Gray-haired. Sharp eyes beneath a weathered face. Warren Pike. Even from the doorway, the man carried himself with the cold confidence of somebody long accustomed to controlling rooms without raising his voice. Miss Belmore, Pike called calmly through the wind. You have caused considerable trouble over papers that do not belong to you. Clara stood frozen behind Elias. Pike's eyes shifted toward Elias next. You must be Whitmore. Elias said nothing. Pike studied the burned Bible tucked beside Elias's saddlebag near the doorway. Then he smiled faintly. Interesting thing about fires, Pike said softly. They reveal what survives. Snow swirled hard between them while the other riders waited silently atop the ridge. Elias rested one hand against the rifle stock. You rode a long way to talk. Pike nodded once. Because I prefer solving problems peacefully. Clara stepped forward suddenly despite Elias trying to stop her. Peacefully. Her voice trembled with anger and disbelief. You destroyed families. Pike looked toward her almost sadly. Railroads build the future, Miss Belmore. Progress always asks for sacrifice. Elias felt something cold settle inside his chest hearing those words. Not fear. Clarity. Pike glanced between them both before speaking again. Give me the papers, and you walk away from this mountain alive. Silence filled the storm. Then Elias Whitmore looked back toward the small fire glowing inside the ranger station. Toward Clara standing beside him clutching her silver cross. Toward the burned Bible rescued from ashes and carried across frozen miles for reasons he finally understood. He turned slowly toward Warren Pike beneath the falling snow. No, Elias said quietly. Just one word. Calm as winter. And somehow heavier than any gunshot.